There is an object sitting in a museum in Wuhan, in central China, that most people walk past without fully understanding what they are looking at. It is a set of 65 bronze bells, arranged across an L-shaped wooden rack that stretches more than 7 meters wide. Each bell produces 2 distinct tones depending on where it is struck. Together, they cover a range of 5 octaves. They were made in 433 BCE, and they were made entirely by hand. No machines, no electricity, no digital calibration. A group of craftsmen working in a foundry in the state of Zeng, in what is now Hubei province, calculated the precise curvature, the exact wall thickness, the specific bronze alloy composition required for each of those 65 bells to produce the exact tones they were supposed to produce. They got it right, every single one. And then, those bells were sealed inside a tomb, and for more than 2,400 years, no one heard them again. That is what this episode is about. Not the rulers who commissioned the objects, not the wars that eventually ended the world those objects came from, but the people who made them. The master craftsmen of ancient China's lost kingdoms, the bronze smiths, the lacquer painters, the jade carvers, the silk weavers, and the architects whose hands built a civilization that most of the modern world has forgotten existed. If you're watching this on television and you'd like to see more stories like this one, the best thing you can do is share it with someone who loves history. And if you're on a device where you can subscribe, please do. It is what keeps this channel alive and growing. To understand what those craftsmen's lives actually looked like, you have to begin not with the objects they made, but with the system that produced them. During the Warring States period, roughly the 5 centuries leading up to China's unification under Qin in 221 BCE, 7 major kingdoms competed for dominance. Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Wei, Zhao, and Qin. Each had its own currency, its own writing conventions, its own philosophical traditions, its own aesthetic vocabulary. And each had its own craftsmen working within systems of production that were quite unlike anything that would exist after unification. There existed a text called the Caogongji, usually translated as the Records of Examination of Craftsmen, compiled sometime around the 5th or 4th century BCE in the state of Qi. It is the oldest known technical encyclopedia in Chinese history. It describes in precise detail the specifications for dozens of different crafts, the correct angles for chariot wheels, the proper alloy ratios for different categories of bronze vessels, the ideal proportions for ritual objects. What the Caogongji reveals is a world where craft was not improvised. It was codified. There were standards. There were inspections. There were expectations so precise that a craftsman's survival in his profession depended on his ability to meet them consistently. The text opens with a statement that is almost philosophical in its ambition. Making things requires the right material, the right skill, the right time, and the right place. Any one of those elements missing, and the object fails. This was not casual observation. It was the operating principle of an entire industry, built on the shoulders of people whose names history has mostly forgotten. Most craftsmen during the Warring States period worked within one of 2 systems. The first was the government workshop, the Guangong, which produced goods directly for the ruling court, staffed partly by conscripted labor and partly by specialists who had been identified as particularly skilled. The second system was the private workshop, often family-based, producing goods for wealthy patrons or for the open market. The experience of working within one versus the other shaped a craftsman's entire life. In the government workshops, a craftsman selected to train as a state artisan typically underwent supervised training lasting about 2 years. After that, if he passed documented assessments of his technical competence, he was registered as a state artisan, with all the obligations and protections that status entailed. Those obligations were not trivial. A state craftsman could be conscripted for specific projects. He was subject to fines if his work was judged defective, and in some kingdoms, particularly in the Qin state, his name was stamped directly onto the objects he produced so that quality could be traced back to the individual responsible. This practice of marking objects with the craftsman's name is one of the most fascinating details to survive from this period. Archaeologists excavating Qin period sites have recovered lacquerware, bronze vessels, and weapons stamped with short inscriptions that identify not just the object's function, but the administrative unit that produced it, the year of its manufacture, and the specific person responsible for its quality. It was a system of accountability that sounds almost modern, and it meant that a craftsman's reputation, good or bad, was literally inscribed on his work. Inscribed reputations also meant inscribed consequences. If an object failed, if a bronze vessel cracked, if a lacquered container's finish peeled, if a weapon proved brittle in use, the record of who made it was right there on the surface. The bamboo slip legal documents discovered at Shuihudi in Yunnan County, Hubei Province in 1975 contain specific regulations governing craftsmen's obligations, the acceptable margins of error in their work, and the penalties for consistently poor production. These were not theoretical laws. They governed the daily reality of working in a state workshop. To understand what that daily reality felt like, consider the bronze foundry at Huma in what is now southern Shanxi province, the site of the ancient Jin state capital, later divided among the states of Han, Wei, and Zhao. The Huma foundry complex, excavated beginning in the mid-20th century, is the largest bronze casting site yet found anywhere in the ancient world. More than 30,000 fragments of clay molds and models were recovered. Earthenware dies, bronze ingots in various stages of processing, fragments of furnace walls, crucibles, slag deposits from thousands of individual casts. What the Huma evidence reveals about the craft of bronze making is a level of sophistication that should genuinely astonish. The foundry did not simply produce one-off objects. It operated on something approaching industrial logic. Among the most significant finds were what scholars call pattern blocks, decorated ceramic stamps that could be pressed repeatedly into clay mold material to create consistent ornamental patterns across large numbers of objects. A craftsman in the Huma foundry did not carve the same dragon pattern from scratch on each new mold. He pressed a pattern block into the clay, reproduced the design precisely, and moved on. Speed without sacrificing quality, consistency without losing complexity. The Huma foundry operated with a division of labor so specialized that different groups of workers were responsible for different stages of the production process: mold making, alloy preparation, the pour itself, the finishing and polishing afterward. The actual process of casting a bronze vessel began weeks or even months before the object appeared. First, a model of the intended object was shaped, typically from clay. From this model, a series of clay section molds were formed, each covering a different part of the surface. The molds were decorated using pattern blocks pressed into the clay, then fired to harden them. The individual sections were assembled around a clay core held in place by small bronze spacers to maintain precise gaps in the vessel wall. The whole assembly was preheated before the pour, because if molten bronze met cold clay molds, the sudden thermal shock could shatter everything. The pour itself used bronze alloy melted in clay crucibles over charcoal furnaces, at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. The alloy composition varied depending on the object's intended use. The Cao Gongji specifies different ratios of copper to tin for different categories of objects. Bells required a specific ratio that optimized resonance. Weapons required a different ratio that maximized hardness without brittleness. Ritual vessels needed yet another balance that produced the right surface color for ceremonial use. Getting these ratios wrong produced an object that looked correct but failed at its fundamental purpose. And in a world where bronze vessels were used in rituals believed to maintain the harmony between the living and the dead, a vessel that failed its ritual function was not a minor matter. The 65 bells found in the tomb of the Marquis Yi of Zeng in Suizhou, Hubei, discovered by archaeologists in 1978 when a military construction team broke through the sealed chamber, represent the absolute pinnacle of what this tradition could achieve. Each bell is shaped not as a simple round cylinder, but as an oval in cross-section. This ovoid geometry is not aesthetic, It is acoustic. It is precisely that shape that allows each bell to produce two separate tones when struck at different points on its surface. Tones separated by a musical interval of a minor or major third. The smallest bell weighs about 2.4 kilograms. The largest exceeds 200 kilograms. All 65 were cast to tolerances that modern acousticians, when they tested the bells after the 1978 discovery, found were remarkably accurate across the full 5-octave range. The state of Chu, which occupied the vast territory of the Middle Yangtze River Valley, centered in present-day Hubei and Hunan provinces, with its capital at Ying near modern Jingzhou, produced the other great craft tradition of the Warring States period. And it was a tradition almost entirely different from the Northern Bronze culture. Chu was the world of lacquer. Lacquer, the sap of the Toxicodendron verniciflua tree, had been worked in China since the Neolithic period, but it was in the Warring States era, and in Chu especially, that lacquer work reached what scholars have called its first great apex. The evidence comes from the extraordinary preservation of Chu tomb goods, recovered from the waterlogged conditions of the Jianghan Plain, from excavations at Jiangling in Hubei province and from Changsha in Hunan province. Thousands of lacquer objects have been recovered. Food vessels, wine containers, musical instrument stands, coffins, screens, weapons, clothing accessories. Together, they document a craft tradition of extraordinary technical and visual sophistication. A lacquer object began with a wooden core, typically light, fine-grained wood shaped by a team of carpenters working separately from the lacquer artists. Over this core, layers of lacquer were applied, each layer allowed to cure completely before the next was added. Lacquer cannot be hurried. It cures through a chemical process requiring specific humidity and temperature ranges. If the conditions are wrong, the layer remains sticky or cures with internal stresses that will eventually cause it to crack. A craftsman working on a fine lacquer object might apply 10 layers, or 20, or more, each adding perhaps half a millimeter to the object's thickness, each requiring days of controlled curing time in a specially prepared space. The total labor investment in a single fine lacquer vessel could represent weeks or months of work before any painting had begun. Here is a detail that most people never imagine. Raw lacquer sap is caustic. Contact with uncured lacquer causes severe allergic reactions in most people. Rashes, swelling, and inflammation that can last for weeks. Lacquer craftsmen spent their working lives in constant exposure to a material that ordinary people could not even touch without consequence. Whether they developed some tolerance over time, or whether they suffered chronically, the sources do not say. What they do say is that the skill required to handle the material correctly was rare, and that skilled lacquer workers commanded a premium that ordinary laborers could not approach. The ancient text known as the Han Feizi, the legalist philosopher, Han Fei's compilation from the 3rd century BCE, criticizes the extravagance of lacquerware production at court. He notes that lacquering a single vessel requires the relay labor of 10 people simply to maintain the curing conditions. He is making an argument against luxury spending, but in doing so, he inadvertently documents exactly how labor-intensive the craft was and how skilled the people performing that labor must have been. By the Warring States period, lacquerware had become so prestigious that ancient sources record it as approximately 10 times more costly than equivalent bronze objects. The painting on Chu lacquerware tells us something profound about an entire worldview. Where Qi and Jin bronzes favored geometric interlace and stylized animals arranged in registers of formal symmetry, Chu lacquer artists painted creatures in continuous transformation. Serpents that sprout dragon heads mid-body, deer whose antlers dissolve into bare branches, birds whose wings become swirling cloud patterns. These are images from a cosmology that believed in constant flux between forms, a universe where the boundaries between animal, spirit, human, and natural phenomenon were permeable. The lacquer surface was not merely a decoration applied to a vessel. It was a window into a different way of understanding the world. The jade carvers occupied a social world unto themselves. Jade in ancient China was not a single specific stone, The word yu covered a range of nephrite minerals valued less for their monetary worth than for their symbolic meaning. The Confucian tradition attributed 5 moral virtues to jade. Its warmth represented benevolence, its transparency represented rectitude, its clear tone when struck represented wisdom, its resistance to bending represented bravery, and its refusal to wound despite its sharp edges represented purity. The gentleman, the junzi, was expected to have jade ornaments on his person at all times, arranged so that they would clink softly against each other as he moved, the sound itself a kind of moral advertisement. The problem with jade was that it could not be carved in the ordinary sense. Jade is harder than steel. Metal tools skate off its surface without leaving a mark. Carving jade required abrasion, patient, relentless, extraordinarily time-consuming grinding using materials harder than the jade itself. In the Warring States period, craftsmen worked jade using rotating tools, charged with powdered quartz and wet sand as cutting media. Researchers at Fudan University in Shanghai, working in 2006 to reconstruct ancient jade cutting techniques experimentally, calculated that cutting jade to a thickness of 21 millimeters from a raw pebble required approximately 68 hours of continuous work using period-correct abrasive tools. That was for a single slice of raw material, before any actual shaping had begun. By the Warring States period, jade carving was at one of its historical peaks. Craftsmen were producing open-work pieces of extraordinary delicacy, objects where the jade had been carved through entirely, creating lattices of negative space between solid forms. They were achieving highly polished surfaces that reflected light with almost mirror-like clarity. They were carving interlaced dragon and phoenix forms whose components appeared to be technically separate, but were interlocked without any joints or connectors, produced from a single piece of stone. These were technical feats that required a craftsman to plan every cut in advance, knowing that jade, unlike bronze, could not be remelted if an error was made. A miscalculation while working an open work piece destroyed the entire object. The only way to avoid that outcome was to not make miscalculations. And the only way to not make miscalculations was to have internalized, through years of practice, a kind of three-dimensional intuition about exactly how the stone would respond to each motion of the tool. Jade workshops were typically attached to elite households or the royal court, because the raw material itself was precious and distant. The primary sources of nephrite jade during the Warring States period were river deposits in what is now northwestern China, far from most of the major kingdoms. Getting jade from its source to a workshop in Linzi or Handan or Ying required long-distance trade networks and the kind of patronage only the highest levels of society could provide. A jade carver without a wealthy patron was a craftsman without material. This dependency shaped the entire social position of jade workers, technically among the most skilled people in any kingdom, but perpetually dependent on the goodwill of the elite for access to the one thing they needed to work. The silk weavers of the Warring States period occupied a different position still, and their story is the most complicated of all, because silk production was not primarily a workshop industry. It was a household industry, particularly for women. The state of Qi, with its capital at Linzi in what is now central Shandong province, was famous throughout the ancient world for its silk. A standard bolt measured approximately 9¼ meters in length, and the width was regulated precisely enough that fabric could serve as a unit of economic exchange. By the Warring States period, silk weaving had achieved a level of technical complexity, enabled by the treadle-operated loom, a device that allowed a weaver to control the shed of the warp threads with their feet, freeing both hands for the more precise work of guiding the weft. This technology enabled the production of sophisticated patterned fabrics, damasks, brocades, gauzes with geometric and animal designs, and embroidered silks where images of dragons and phoenixes were built up stitch by stitch in colored thread. The development from chain stitch to split stitch during this period allowed embroiderers to achieve gradations of color and texture that gave their work an almost painterly quality. Fabrics recovered from Warring States-era tombs in the Changsha and Jiangling regions show patterns of such precision that modern textile historians have studied them extensively to reconstruct exactly what kind of loom technology would have been required to produce them. The women who worked these looms occupied a paradoxical social position. In the Confucian moral universe, weaving was one of the 4 essential activities of the virtuous woman. There was an ancient saying, "If a woman does not weave, she will be cold." But if a woman did weave, if she was skilled at it, if she could produce silk of sufficient quality for elite consumption, she was producing one of the most economically significant commodities of the ancient world. The contradiction between the low social status attached to manual labor and the high economic value of what that labor produced was a tension that ran through the entire artisan class. This tension is visible in the 4 classes system. The Simin, that organized warring state society in the Confucian framework. Scholars ranked first, farmers second, artisans third, merchants last. The artisan ranked above the merchant because artisans created something real, something that had not existed before. But artisans ranked below farmers because farmers produced grain that kept everyone alive, while artisans produced objects that, however beautiful and technically impressive, were ultimately secondary to survival. This theoretical hierarchy did not always match economic reality. A master bronzesmith working on commission for a major court could earn more in a year than most farmers would see in a decade. But officially and formally, in the moral accounting of the age, the craftsman was the 3rd person in a hierarchy of 4, and no amount of skill changed that designation. What changed things? What made the Warring States period genuinely distinctive in the history of Chinese craft was competition. When 7 kingdoms compete against each other militarily, diplomatically, and economically, each one has a powerful incentive to develop the best craftsmen, the best weapons, the most impressive goods for diplomatic exchange. A lord who could send bronze vessels of exceptional quality as gifts to allied states was advertising the sophistication of his court. The competitive dynamics of the multi-kingdom world drove investment in craft production in a way that a unified empire under a single set of standards might never have generated. The sword of Gujian is perhaps the most famous artifact of this dynamic. Found in a Chu tomb in Jiangling in 1965, it is a bronze sword made in the state of Yue, the kingdom in what is now Zhejiang province, known for the extraordinary quality of its metallurgy. After more than 2,400 years buried in damp soil, the sword remained sharp enough to cut through a stack of 20 sheets of paper without difficulty. Its blade shows almost no corrosion. Analysis of the metal revealed a sophisticated composite construction. The core uses a different alloy than the edge, with the edge containing a higher tin content to maximize hardness, while the core uses a lower tin alloy to prevent brittleness. The blade's surface is covered with a pattern of black diamond shapes produced by a process that metallurgists are still not entirely certain about. The hilt is inlaid with turquoise and bound with silk thread. And on the blade, in archaic script, 8 characters identify the sword as belonging to the king of Yue himself. This object was not produced by accident. It is the result of a craft tradition refined across generations, in which the swordsmiths of Yue had developed techniques for composite blade construction, surface treatment, and decorative inlay that no other kingdom had quite replicated. The Shiji records the legendary swordsmiths Gan Zhang and Mo Ye as figures of almost mythological skill, craftsmen whose ability to produce blades of supernatural sharpness was understood as something beyond ordinary human capability. The myth reveals the cultural weight of the craft. In a world where warfare was constant and the quality of weapons could determine the outcome of battles that determined the fate of kingdoms, the swordsmith was a figure of strategic importance. The architectural craftsmen, the carpenters, earth-rammers, and timber framers who built the palaces and elite residences of the Warring States period occupied yet another world, and it is one that has left fewer movable objects for archaeologists to study because buildings unlike bronze or jade do not survive. What does survive is what lay beneath them. The rammed earth platforms, the post hole patterns, the drainage channels, and the fragments of roof tiles recovered from excavation sites across northern China. At Linzi in Shandong, at Handan in southern Hebei, at the remains of the Chu capital near modern Jingzhou, archaeologists have traced the outlines of structures whose scale was extraordinary by any pre-modern standard. The major halls of a warring state's palace stood on massive platforms of rammed earth, hangtu, constructed by teams of workers using a technique refined across centuries. Layer upon layer of loose soil was laid down and pounded to near stone density using heavy wooden rams, building up platforms that could rise 10 meters or more above the surrounding ground level. The Zhanghua Terrace, built by King Ling of Chu near modern Jiangling and Qianjiang counties in Hubei, rose approximately 23 meters high. According to ancient sources, visitors needed 3 separate resting stops simply to climb to the top. Modern archaeologists excavating the site between 1999 and 2001 identified 22 separate rammed earth platform foundations spread across an area that speaks to a construction effort of enormous scale. On top of these platforms rose timber-framed halls, whose construction required a completely different set of skills. The master carpenter was responsible for the structural logic of the entire building, the placement of columns, the joinery of beams and rafters, the calculation of loads and spans. Chinese timber architecture of this period used no nails. Everything was held together by the precision fit of mortise and tenon joints, shaped and cut so accurately that the friction and interlocking geometry of the wood itself carried the loads. A badly cut joint was not just aesthetically imperfect, it was structurally compromised. In a hall whose columns carried the weight of an elaborate tiled roof over a span of many meters, structural compromise meant collapse. When the Qin state conquered the last of its rival kingdoms in 221 BCE, and the first emperor declared himself ruler of a unified China, one of the most immediate consequences for the artisan class was standardization. The Qin standardization edicts, which covered weights, measures, coinage, the width of cart axles, and the forms of written characters, were not simply administrative rationalization. They were an assertion of uniformity over a world that had been characterized by productive diversity. The different bronze styles of Qi and Chu, the different lacquer traditions of the Jiangling workshops versus the Qin state workshops, the different jade vocabularies of the northern and southern courts, all of these were now expected to resolve into a single imperial aesthetic. The craftsmen who had built their skills within specific regional traditions suddenly found themselves operating within a system that wanted something different from what they knew. Some adapted. Some were relocated. The Qin state had a practice of moving skilled craftsmen from conquered territories to the capital at Xianyang, in what is now Shanxi province, so that their expertise could be concentrated and redirected toward imperial projects. The construction of the first emperor's tomb complex at Mount Li, near present-day Lintong in Xi'an, required craftsmen of every kind, bronze workers to cast the famous warriors' weapons, which were real functional weapons with their surfaces chemically treated against corrosion, architects to construct underground chambers, lacquer artists to coat the wooden ceilings, jade carvers for the ritual objects. In some sense, it was the greatest single commission in Chinese history. And it was staffed partly by craftsmen who had come from the very kingdoms the emperor had destroyed. What those craftsmen thought about their situation, the historical record does not say. They left no memoirs. Their names, even when stamped on objects, tell us almost nothing about their inner lives, only that they were there, that they worked, that their work survived when they did not. What we do know is that when the Qin dynasty collapsed, as it did catastrophically, within 15 years of the first emperor's death, torn apart by the rebellions that brought the Han dynasty to power, the artisan traditions of the old kingdoms did not disappear. They had been carried in the hands and memories of living people through the transition. Han lacquerware bears the clear imprint of Chu traditions. Han bronze styles echo the technical achievements of the warring states' foundries. The jade carvers who worked for the early Han emperors built on the skills of their warring states' predecessors so directly that scholars can sometimes barely distinguish the work of one era from the other. The hands that built China's lost world were also the hands that built what came after it. The 65 bells in Wuhan have been studied, replicated, and played in concert performances since their discovery. Modern copies exist in museums around the world. Engineers with acoustic measurement tools have confirmed what was already audible. The original craftsman got the physics exactly right. But there is something that no measurement can capture, which is the sheer human fact of what it took to get there. Years of practice within a tradition refined across generations. A workshop culture where knowledge passed from master to apprentice through direct physical demonstration, where the correct motion of a tool was learned not by reading about it, but by doing it 10,000 times until it became involuntary. A life organized around the demands of a material. Bronze, lacquer, jade, silk, that gave back exactly what you put into it. Nothing more and nothing less. The people who built China's lost world rarely thought of themselves as builders of history. They thought of themselves as bronzesmiths, as lacquer painters, as jade carvers, as people with a specific set of skills, working within a specific set of obligations, trying to meet the expectations of patrons who were sometimes generous and sometimes terrifying. They did their work. They put their names on it when they were required to, and then they were gone. The objects stayed, and if those objects still carry something of the people who made them, encoded in the curve of a bronze surface, in the layered depth of lacquer that took months to build, in the open-work geometry of a jade pendant carved without the right to make a single mistake, then perhaps the craftsmen of China's lost world did leave something of themselves behind after all. Not in words, in the work itself, which is, when you think about it, exactly what any master craftsman would have wanted. In the next episode, we go inside the world that all of this built and ask what ordinary people's lives looked like under the first great unified empire that these same craftsmen helped create.